Hi there, thanks for tuning into my video. My name's Josh Vale and I run and are the co-founder of a company called M1 Property Limited that lets out residential properties to tenants in England and Wales. This is a very basic guide I put together to letting your property. It will cover the basic scenarios about finding tenants, letting out your property and moving tenants into your property, as well as the end of the tenancy, and will hopefully give you a very basic guidance as to how to let out your property. This isn't supposed to be a comprehensive guide. If we went through every scenario that could be dealt with in the world of property letting, we'd probably be here forever, at least a million years. But it is just a basic guide to those who've never done it before. So to start with, about me, I've been a residential landlord since 2010, where I bought my first investment property. I've been doing this as my exclusive source of income since 2020. Before that, I had a full-time job and then a part-time job in education. Since 2010, I've built a property portfolio that's now worth over £1.5 million. It cash flows about £150,000 a year. And since 2010, I've faced situations such as fires at properties, floods, car crashes, the death and disability of tenants, storm damage, lightning strikes, everything in between, and so have faced absolutely every situation you could possibly ever face as a residential landlord. In my line of work, I have private tenants, I have people who pay their rent through disability benefits, and those who pay their rent using universal credit. I don't really care how people get their money, just as long as they get paid my rent. Now in this presentation, we're going to cover how to check that your mortgage and home insurance allow you to let out your property. We're going to cover how to find tenants, how to let out your property to a tenant, moving the tenant in, and managing your property. We'll also then very briefly cover how to end your tenancy. All of these will be covered in quite a basic way. I'm looking to do a series of videos over the next few months that will cover all of these areas in a lot more detail. So to start, how to check that your mortgage and home insurance allow you to let your property out. I find that this is incredibly important if you are coming to letting properties out for the first time, as many people start with their previous family home or a relative's one that they just don't want to sell. Usually, you can find on your mortgage deed or insurance document whether you're allowed to let out your property. If it doesn't mention anything at all, then you can give them a quick call, either the mortgage company or the insurance company, and check whether they allow you to do this. A weirdly known fact, or a lesser known fact I should say, is that most residential mortgage companies will convert a residential mortgage to a buy-to-let mortgage if you give them enough notice. It's usually a month, but depends on the company and how busy they are. However, they usually charge more on a buy-to-let mortgage as the risk is greater to them, so check that it's financially worth it for you to let out this property rather than selling it. Your home insurance, if it's a residential policy, will usually not cover a buy-to-let property or a property that you're letting out. So specialist landlord insurance exists. It's to be found on price comparison sites and through insurance brokers. There are special cases and special restrictions that apply on HMOs, that's homes of multiple occupation, where a bunch of different people are occupying a house. So you'll always need to check with the insurance company if you need to before you let it out. That moves us through into finding tenants. Once you've decided to let your property, the next step, of course, is to find tenants for it. It's no real good having an empty property, as that's not generating you any money. The process of going through finding tenants depends on whether you're looking to manage this property yourself or through a lettings agent. If you're letting through an agent, the agent should find tenants for you, they should take care of all the paperwork, and they should make sure that the general running of the property is going well. Although this does depend on the contract you sign with them, the agreement you make with them. So always discuss that with the agent. Check the T&Cs on the contract, as well as the fees that you're signing carefully before you do sign the contract. It's especially important for break clauses, as if you've got a property that's empty for a few months. Again, it's not generating any money, and you'll need to maybe find a new agent. If you are self-managing, you can list your properties on Rightmove and Zoopla. You can either get an agent's license for yourself, which costs about £1,500, £1,500 a year for each site, or you can go through companies such as OpenRent. If you do go through a company like OpenRent, you can pay a flat fee per property to get them listed, but usually you'll need to do the viewings yourself. You'll be surprised, but social media such as Facebook is also a remarkably good place to market your property. You tend to get quality tenant leads through these sites. A big tip that I learned over the years was when I was managing properties and rentals with my full-time job, was making use of open days. It's not only cut down the cost of travelling to properties every different single day, it also limited the amount of time I had to spend looking for tenants and showing the property to people. Nothing worse than booking in 10 tenants for prospective viewings for a day and having 8 of them cancel on you. But that's worse if you've got it spread out over a week and they keep cancelling on you. An open day, you tend to book tenants every half an hour slots, for example, throughout the day, and they come at their respective times, the designated times, view the property, and then get on their merry way. Then to get feedback later on, either the same day or next day. But a top tip when finding tenants is it's very easy to overpromise and underdeliver. It's usually the case that you'd never want to promise something to a tenant that you can't deliver on. So be clear and open with people viewing, either on the limitations of the property or on what's included. It can be, for example, you have an area of damaged paintwork in the property. Never promise a tenant you're going to restore that paintwork or repaint that wall if you're just not going to. Same about being honest with a tenant regarding shared driveways, access to gardens, communal gardens, etc., as these things will come out later on and will cause you more problems down the line. Having found your tenant, you can then of course move on to letting the property to a tenant. A top tip is to make sure that you get everything together before offering a lease to a tenant. Get all your paperwork in order, get everything ready to go before showing to prospective tenants, so that when somebody wants to rent it from you, you're able to provide all this paperwork to them straight away. Preparation is therefore key. In England and Wales, as this specifically covers England and Wales and not other countries, the minimum you will need to provide to a tenant is, first of all, the Government's Guide to Renting pamphlet from the gov.uk website. This is a very basic pamphlet. It covers the rights and responsibilities of tenants and landlords for the tenant, and you can download it and send it off by email to them. You also need to provide electric and gas safety check certificates. This is important because nobody wants a dead tenant, and if the electrical system's faulty, if the gas appliances are going to break down and either explode or gas them while they're sleeping, then the tenant would probably like to know that, as he needs to know whether he's getting a good deal or whether he's likely to die. If you don't have these in place, the electric and gas safety certificates, you can be fined from the local authority and by the council. It's very important to have these in place. It's very important to get these done before you show a property to a prospective tenant, as you never know when someone's going to be available to come and do them. It's important to note the EPC must be valid and have a higher than E rating, or E or higher, I should say, in order for a property to be let out. And this is correct as of January 2022 when I'm recording this video. There's some consultation in the government about changing that to more energy efficient properties. However, that's not been passed by Parliament yet. And this is the case unless the property is listed on the exempt register, such as a listed building. Once you get an EPC, the EPC is then valid for the property and not the individual for a course of 5 years. So if you bought a property 5 years ago You'll have an EPC in place when you bought it. You'll then look to rent it out now. Check that it's still valid. Otherwise, it is illegal to rent out your property. You need to provide to prospective tenants the details of the deposit protection scheme you're using to protect their deposit. You must protect a tenant's deposit within 30 days of their move-in date. Otherwise, you'll be fined. And a weird one, but important, is you need to give the tenant your relevant contact details. It's either yours or your agent's contact details, but it is your name, address, and a contact telephone number so they can reach you in an emergency. Most people also provide tenants with an email address, but that's not a legal requirement. There are some additional things as well, unfortunately. First of all, smoke detectors must be in place on each floor of the property, not just in the kitchen, not just in the living room or the bedroom, but on each floor. And they must be working when the tenant moves in. They can be either battery powered or wired in. Most people, when they're redecorating rental properties these days, are getting wired in systems, as they give you a better fire rating, higher fire rating, but these aren't necessarily required as it stands. Carbon monoxide detectors must also be placed near the gas boiler and in rooms with appliances which use solid fuel, such as coal and wood. This could mean in a living room, for example, if you've got an open fire that uses a solid form of fuel, then you need to place a carbon monoxide detector nearby to make sure you're not gassing the people in the room and that the appliance is safe to use. Becoming increasingly important now, you must also check with your local council whether you're in an area where you need to register your rental property. This is a scheme that councils are increasingly using in order to make sure the properties that are let out in their area are safe for people to live in and up to a certain standard. It usually costs about £500 per property to start the registration process. However, the cost can be higher for HMOs and larger houses. And if it's not done, again, you can face fines up to £10,000 per property and the risk of criminal prosecution. The process to get registered is usually you contact the council, pay the application fee, you show them all the documentation for the property, your gas and electric safety certificates, your EPCs, the fact that you've got fire alarms in place. The council then send an inspector to check on it, and if everything's in place, they'll sign off on it, or they'll give you an improvement notice that you'll need to demonstrate that you've done before they'll sign off. The whole process takes about 6 weeks, and if you've got everything documented beforehand, it's relatively straightforward. And just a quick reminder, if you don't have all these things in place, you may not be able to evict your tenants if you need to, and you may open yourself up to legal trouble, either by the tenant or the local authority. So most of these are not optional things to do. So having put all your documentation in place, having made sure that the gas and electrical safety certificates are there, that the property is safe and comfortable for the tenant to live in, especially warm, what do you need from the tenant prior to them moving in? And the answer is actually very little. It's very less rigid about what the tenant needs to provide to you as the landlord in order for them to move into your property. At a minimum, absolute minimum, you need to check their ID and keep a copy of it. That's either their passport, their visa or identity card, to prove that the tenant has the right to rent in the UK. A driving licence is not acceptable, and unfortunately a birth certificate showing the UK usually isn't acceptable. However, if you do have a tenant who can't provide a passport, visa or identity card, then there is a form that the tenant can use to self-certify, available on the Home Office website. If in doubt as to whether an ID is acceptable, you'll always check on the Home Office website, as there is a guide on there. Again, if you don't do this, you can be fined and you can get in a lot of legal trouble. The rest is optional. The rest is up to you. You may want to credit check a tenant before they move in. It's not a legal requirement, but you might want to check that they're able to actually pay their rent every month. There's various private companies available that charge a small fee, but will do this for you. You may want to collect references from a tenant prior to move in. Again, this is optional and will usually cost you money to do using a private company, or you can do it yourself. But it will usually give you a better insurance rating and or more legal protections, such as lost rental insurance if you do so. This means if a tenant's not paying rent to you, and you've referenced and credit checked them, you can use your renter's insurance in order to get the money from the insurance company. Again, check your policy wording if that applies to you. Weirdly enough, you also need a signature on the lease agreement. That's a lease agreement that's either prepared by you or a solicitor. If you're not sure what to include, then a solicitor will usually charge £30 to £40 to prepare a lease agreement for you, which you can then use as a template for your future lettings. Most councils, where you have to pay your council tax to, won't accept a tenant has moved in for council tax purposes unless you can provide to them a signed rental agreement. It's the same with utility companies. Most utility companies won't accept a tenant's moved in unless you're showing them a signed rental agreement. This means that you can be held responsible for utilities to the property, such as gas and electric, where the tenant doesn't have to pay, and that would not be very good for your bottom line. So having moved in the tenant, having advertised it, having made sure that we're up to the minimum legal standards to let out our property, we then move on quickly to managing the property. Again, this depends on whether it's managed or self-managed, as if you're using a management agency, then they'll usually look after everything, but they usually will charge you for the repairs done to the property. At the absolute minimum, if you're self-managing, you should inspect the property every 3 months to ensure there's nothing illegal happening or anything that could invalidate your insurance at the property. At the 3-month check, usually check the fabric of the house is okay, the tenants aren't obviously growing any drugs or anything that could invalidate your insurance, that they're not smoking inside the property if that's prohibited by the lease, as again that can invalidate your insurance, and they're not doing anything else, such as overcrowding, that could open you up to legal trouble. I usually check signs that the number of people in the property is as agreed when they moved in, such as if there's random mattresses strewn on the floor or obvious bedding, or far too many clothes for one person in a one-bedroom flat. I tend to ask the question, what's going on? When I'm managing any of the properties, I also make sure that we always fix things as they break. Smaller expenses now can save us much bigger expenses down the line. For example, I had one landlord a few years ago who during a storm lost some roof tiles on his roof. Instead of paying a couple of £100 to replace the roof tiles, he left it. More rainwater got in, it ended up completely flooding the upper floor and cost him a couple of £1,000 in repairs, both in redecoration, new carpets, new wiring and everything else. So it's always better to fix something as it occurs, even if it's stressful, because it will save you bigger problems down the line. It also shows tenants that you're a responsible and good landlord who they can rent from for many, many years. It's also the law that you've got to give reasonable notice before you inspect the property or have repairs done. In practical terms, this has been held as around 24 hours is sufficient notice, but if it's a scheduled inspection I know that I'm going to be doing for many months, I'll give the tenant as much notices as I feel is necessary, either a week, a month, or maybe longer, to tell them that I'm coming, or to remind them closer to the time. This doesn't apply if there's an emergency, such as a flood, a fire, a gas leak, that you've got to get into the property to make it safe, or your representative has to make it into the property to it's safe. But you should always notify the tenant what you've done after the fact so they know what's happening. Usually in an emergency such as a flood, fire, gas explosion, the tenant will be in the property or nearby though, unless they're on holiday, so they should be easy to inform. A big rule of thumb, and very important, is don't allow yourself to be intimidated by your tenants. If a tenant wants purely to discuss things over the phone and later turns around and denies that you've agreed the things you have in person, then don't be afraid to put things in writing so you have a record of your conversations. I find even when discussing things on the phone, it's easy afterwards just to summarise it on an email send what we discussed over to the tenant, and then we both got it in writing. This can save you problems down the line. Again, this is just a very basic guide to renting out properties, a very basic guide to managing properties. If you have any questions, my contact details are at the end of this presentation, so you can send them over to me by text or by email or by phone, and I'll be glad to answer them. And managing the property, we ask, what should we do when things go wrong? This could be anything from tenants not paying, to gas explosions, to fires, to storm damage, and all sorts of things that can happen at a property. Well, the most important thing, of course, is to stay calm. These situations can be stressful, but it's always best to be calm and respectful to your tenant, even if they're stressed, even if they're shouting at you, even if they're trying to intimidate you. It can feel very personal when you're letting out a property, especially if it was your family's before you hand it over to a tenant. The important thing is to stay professional, stay calm, and if you need to, communicate only in writing, by email, by text, by letter if you need to. Otherwise, again, you're going to cause more stress for everyone in this situation. If something's going wrong, document it. Document everything. What's happened, what you're doing about it, what the tenant's doing about it, as it can cover you in court proceedings later on. If the tenant, for example, wants to get out of his lease because he decides you're not fixing things quick enough, you can demonstrate to the court that you are in fact fixing things very quickly, and with professional tradesmen, then the court will side with you. And good advice is always to work with your tenant to find a solution. For example, if a tenant calls you and says, I can't pay my rent this month because I've lost my job, but I can offer you, for example, £100 a week until I get a new job, at which point I'll cover the arrears. That's usually a case where you say, okay, what can we do? Sit down, talk to them, work through a solution. The solution might be that they need to hand you the keys back if they're just not going to be able to afford the rental payments going forward, and that's okay. It could be that the tenant needs repairs to his car to get to work, and so we'll have to put off paying you for a couple of weeks. Again, work with the tenant to find a solution, and if the solution is they hand you the keys back, you go your separate ways, that's also okay. This is a business, and if you treat people like human beings, 99% of the time they'll treat you like a human being back. And if all else fails, there is of course the eviction process. Section 8, Section 21's abandonments. Now, I'm going to do a series of these presentations where I cover eviction process in detail later on, and this is a very basic introduction to letting. We're not going to cover these here. There are resources online if you want to have a look, or like I say, there will be other presentations coming online very shortly. And talking of eviction processes, we come on to ending the tenancy. Usually your tenancy agreement will state how you can end the tenancy either mid-agreement or at the end of the agreement. If it doesn't, and if you're concerned, have your tenancy agreement looked over by a lawyer, a housing solicitor who can advise you directly. Again, we come back to treating the tenant like a human being. If ending or renewing the agreement, give the tenant plenty of notice. It's going to be if you're raising the rent or keeping the rent as it is. Usually give 1 month notice to a tenant who's coming up to the end of their agreement, unless they've got a short lease, such as a monthly rolling one would usually give a few days. But in most situations, it will be a month's notice of what we're doing at the end of the lease. This allows the tenant to either find a new place or agree to the renewal, and gives you a chance to also find new tenants if you need to, so that there's continuity of occupation. Good advice: if evicting due to issues with the tenant or the tenancy, please make sure to do it through the courts. It's more time consuming and it's more expensive than turning up on their doorstep swinging a baseball bat to get them out to your house, but it will save you a lot of legal problems down the line. It can be frustrating working with the courts, it really can. It can be frustrating working to get your money that you feel you're owed back from the deposit protection schemes you're registered with. But again, stay calm, stay professional, and you'll be absolutely fine. If you don't think you will be, hand your property over to an agent They've dealt with these situations a million times before, and they can help you. Top tip, good tenants are worth their weight in gold. Don't put the rent up unnecessarily at the end of a tenancy, as you just never know who you'll get in next. If your tenant is respectful, if they look after your property, if they pay rent every month on time, then there's no need to put your rent up by 10% unless your costs have massively gone up at the end of a tenancy. There's no need to try and force that tenant out, because you just never know who you're going to get in next. It could be someone who's perfectly pleasant, but it turns out they're a nightmare tenant. Thanks for watching. Look, this is a very, very basic guide to letting out your property. If you do have any questions or comments on the things I've listed here, or if you need someone to manage your rental property, call or email me. My name's Josh Vale. I work for M1 Property Limited. The email address is contact m1property@gmail.com, or you can call or text 07889 347 403. Thank you for watching. And like I say, there'll be a series of these guys coming on over the next couple of months. Have a good day. Goodbye.